You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Our opening prayer is from the book of Job. In the land of Uz, there was a blameless and upright man named Job, who feared God and avoided evil. Welcome to this series of Catholic Seasons. We're going to take a look at the book of Job. And some of our goals will be to find the origin of the book, what's behind it in a sense, what are some of the literary devices that are used in the book and how they're used, some of the basic questions that are raised by the author of the book of Job and the answers that are given, and then also to some issues that are raised in the discussion of Job and his friends. The character of Job is something that is familiar in general culture, but there are deeper issues to deal with. And so we're going to go a little bit further, quite a bit further, than the popular thought. We also, too, want to see how Job, in the book of Job in the Old Testament of our Bible, relates to Christianity. And also, too, to say a little bit about how Job relates to one's own life and the relevance of this book of the Old Testament for us today. But first, we need to take a look at some theological background. There are two theological perspectives in the Old Testament. One looks at the world and sees a certain order in it, in nature, and, more importantly, a certain order in human activity. Now, some might call this natural law. It is a sense of justice, of fairness. For people of faith, it is a belief in God and His providence that watches over this world and keeps things in order. We need to get in line with this order. Then things will be well for us. This is the view of the wisdom writers of the Old Testament, and the book of Job is part of the wisdom literature. Biblical scholars refer to this perspective of the Old Testament as creation theology. God is the creator of all the universe, and this universe is not haphazard, nor is it chaotic. There is order and purpose. There is a destiny. While there can be coincidences and chance occurrences, overall this is not the rule, but rather the exception. Another perspective for the Old Testament, its counterpart, not its opposition, but its counterpart, is known as salvation history theology. In this perspective, one emphasizes God's entering into the events of our world in order to save us. So, salvation history theology. This is the concern of the narrative parts of the Bible and the prophets. The calls of Abraham and Moses, the plagues and the escape from Egypt, the exile and the return to the promised land are all part of salvation history. And as I said, these two views are not in opposition. They are complementary. They are established by the one God. And Jesus combines both perfectly. Jesus is called the wisdom of God. And He entered into our history at the Incarnation. So He combines both of these perspectives and fulfills them as He does fulfill all of the Old Testament. So those are the two perspectives. The creation theology, stressing God as the creator and putting order into the world, and our getting in line with this order. And salvation history theology, that God entered into our world in time and did so in order to save us. Now, going to this creation theology perspective and things being in order, what about when things get out of order? When things go awry? when things don't happen the way they should, or at least the way we expect. Some of this we can explain. Disasters happen in the world. Accidents happen. Sometimes we're responsible for those accidents. We can hurt ourselves. We can hurt others. And now perhaps we have a little bit more of a sensitivity that we can hurt nature as well. But moving a step further, what of what we call innocent suffering? Even when we can explain something on a scientific level, oftentimes we still can't understand. We question why, and we also question how. Sometimes we can give the answer of how it happened on a scientific or historical level. Sometimes we can't. And oftentimes the why is the most difficult. Why did this happen? Theologians refer to this as the question of theodicy. 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 Basically, the question is, how can a good, beneficent God allow bad things to happen seemingly without reason or purpose? In other words, what is the relationship of a just and good God to evil? How can they be reconciled? Or can they even? This is what the author of Job wants to explore. And he certainly is not the first to do so. People through the ages have wrestled with this conundrum, and people still seek an understanding to this day. Perhaps it is phrased in our modern world as, how can God let this happen? Some even phrase it, why did God do this? It has even caused some to give up their faith in God. People to say, I can't believe in a God that would let this happen. Why would he allow this? Or worse, why did he cause this? Now, there are theories from other cultures through history. In the ancient world, there were gods and goddesses. And in those ancient times, some people thought that the gods were capricious. It's one answer. That's why these things happen. Others thought that the gods liked to see people suffer. A chilling thought, but it's been proposed. Others, in ancient times, thought that one or more of these gods or goddesses had been slighted and therefore were punishing people. Others have said, well, it doesn't really matter. Some of the works that have been examined, and we won't have time to go through them here, we want to stay just on the book of Job, but I'm mentioning a couple of them because the author of Job is aware of these books, of these writings, and wants to answer them. One is called A Debate Over Suicide. And in this pagan writing, the author goes back and forth. Is it better to live and suffer? Or should you commit suicide and end it all and be with the gods in a better place? Why not end it all and be through with the suffering? But the writer of this work, this debate over suicide, in the final analysis comes to the realization that you don't really know for sure what will be in the next life. Think of Shakespeare, for instance, and his very famous passage, to be or not to be. And so the ancient author, not Shakespeare, but one way before Shakespeare in dealing with this issue, came to the conclusion it's better to stay alive. Another ancient work has a master proposing different behaviors to his slave. And whatever he proposes, the slave, the servant, will give good reasons to do it. But then the master will propose the exact opposite. And the servant will say, well, that's a good thing to do too. Maybe it's even better. The point for that ancient work was simply that you can argue for anything. You can make a case either way. And so that author came to the conclusion it doesn't really make any difference. Another ancient work had a peasant being tricked by someone. And the peasant looks for justice, protests to the civil authorities, and he's denied justice. Like Job, he gets bolder and bolder. He's rebuked. He's beaten up for his trouble. And the more he presses the case, the more he's beaten up. He can get no satisfaction from rulers, and so finally he threatens to go to the gods. And this works in his favor, and he gets his justice finally. Yet another work has a sufferer and his friend talking in a similar way that Job talks and debates with his friends. And so we have some precedents for this. And again, these were known to the author of Job. Yet another one is a man sort of stepping outside of himself and debating with himself, or debating with a friend. And they come to the conclusion, some of them, that since everybody suffers, why be pious? What good does it do you? And one of the friends in one of these works says, well, that insults the gods, and you don't want to do that. And most all of these ancient pagan works will say that we are the cause of our suffering, never the gods. And so what you need to do is keep lamenting to your God, if you have a personal God, or to the gods in general, or one that you like, or whatever, whoever it might be, God or goddess, until that God or goddess answers you. Yet a variation on that is that your God is in a dispute with another God, and the other God is taking it out on you. Or you yourself have insulted one or more of the gods. And so these works usually just have you placate the gods and don't try to understand why. Some other theories proposed in ancient times were that the gods are too remote to care about us here on this earth, or it is beneath them, or the gods are teasing us, or even worse, they're just cruel by nature. Now, the author of Job will look at some of these answers put forth by different cultures and writers. And that is what the author wants to do, wants to examine the answers that have been given and to see if they are sufficient or not. And so the author is probing these things. These theories about suffering, theodicy, were rather well known as theories about why we suffer. And so the author of Job does not recount them in any detail. They would have been known to his original audience. But he can refer to them and he can discuss them, in a sense, and show where they are lacking. So given this background, you can take a look at Job himself. Job is good. He's religious, yet he suffers terribly. So whose fault is that, if anyone's? Is Job owed something for his suffering? And who then owes it? We can see this even into our own day, the reactions that people will have to disasters. Some will submerge their feelings and act very stoically. Others will take a simplistic approach and simply say, well, that's God's will. We've got to endure it. Yet, we know from our theology, especially with our Christianity and other religions as well, God does not will evil. And so we have to deal with that then. We still have the problem. There is evil in the world. And what is God going to do about it, if anything? God does not will evil, but he seems to tolerate it. Many would take that as an answer. At the other extreme, you have people who will lash out at God and lose their faith or go into despair or use it as an excuse to give up. Others, if it is dealing with not their own suffering but someone else's, may come to the conclusion, well, the person who's suffering, some way they must have deserved it. Job will test all of these reactions and will even go further. He gets an answer, but not one that he expected. And that's part of the power of the story. This is not just a philosophical discourse, the book of Job, but it is a real-life drama. Now, these things are happening to Job. He's got to go through this suffering. And that's what gives the story power. It is not just a dry treatise. It is a real-life situation, at least for Job. So a little background about the book itself. According to most scholars, it was written after the exile. And the exile, this would be of the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was in 721 BC. The southern kingdom was in 586, 587 BC, the Babylonian exile that we read so much about in the Old Testament. The temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. Jerusalem was destroyed. The southern kingdom was gone. The north had fallen, as I said, in 721, and now everything is gone by 586. So, if it is post-exilic, Job can be a symbolic character for all of Israel. But yet, Job is also an individual. And again, this is what gives the story its personal power. We can relate to it personally. It's not just something corporate that happened to the nation of Israel. Job may be a historical figure. We don't really have that much evidence, but we don't need it really, because Job is, in a sense, every man and every woman. There are similar characters in secular literature and also in the experience of the prophets in the Bible itself. And the book of Job has often been compared to Greek tragedy. In Greek thought, there were gods and goddesses, and they set limits for people. When a person went beyond those limits due to pride or any other reason, but usually due to pride, which was called hubris, there was a nemesis, an agent of divine wrath that came to punish the pride, the hubris, which caused one to defy the limits set by the gods and goddesses. And so, in some ways, Job is similar to this, or so it would seem. Certainly the author of Job is dealing with those kinds of issues. And so pride, going beyond limits set by the gods, and then some kind of whatever it might be, depending on the culture or that, some kind of return to balance, if you want to put it that way, or in some ways, some kind of comeuppance, we would say, in popular vernacular. The text of the book is in Hebrew in the Old Testament, and it's a very difficult text. There are errors in the transmission of the text over the centuries, and it causes different readings of the text. Scholars debate which particular reading of the text is to be considered authentic, or at least as close as we can get to the original. And remember, we have no original manuscript or autograph of any biblical book, even of the New Testament. You have only copies. And some, especially for the Old Testament, are far removed from the original. And sometimes we can't recover them. Sometimes we can. There are scholars working in this area who devote their entire careers to this work. It's called textual criticism. They try to come back as close as they can to the original text. Textual criticism could actually be a topic for this series of Catholic writings, and that maybe in the future. There is much vocabulary in the book of Job which is unique. It's found only in the book of Job, so sometimes it's difficult to translate or even to understand in the original, because there's no other usage which can be consulted to determine the word's meaning. Now, the outline of the book itself. There is a prologue. It consists of the first 2 chapters. It sets the stage, gives the context, and actually the pretext for the whole story. Then there's a middle section. Often in Bibles, in the vernacular, it's set in the form of poetry, although it would be blank verse in modern terminology. There are no rhyme patterns. And this poetic middle consists of a series of speeches. Job is visited by 3 friends. Each speaks, and Job responds to each. This cycle of 3 speeches and 3 rejoinders is repeated 3 times in varying lengths. Job ends these cycles stating his position and summing up the debate that has gone before. We then discover that there is another person who has been listening in and now presents his own views in a forceful speech. And then finally God himself comes and speaks and ends all the discussion. After this middle section, the book closes with an epilogue in the last chapter. If you ask anyone about the story of Job, they would give you what is in the prologue and the epilogue. Job is good. He's pious. He's a devout man. He is sorely tried by his God and remains steadfast. Finally, after much travail and much debate with his friends, he's rewarded, and even more, he is given riches and wealth beyond what he had beforehand. He's actually better off. Now, the book of Job follows the conventional wisdom, which is simply do good and you will prosper. There is justice in the world. You get what you deserve. But yet Job didn't deserve his troubles. He did in the end prevail and was better off. But if you take simply the prologue and the epilogue, he's very wealthy, very pious. He loses it all, goes through all kinds of terrible experiences, suffers greatly, but then finally gets it all back. But that leaves out the whole center of the story, really. That's really, again, just the prologue and the epilogue. And it's the center that's the whole point of the story. It's the probing. It's the asking of the questions. It's the debate. Job tears into the conventional wisdom. His 3 friends represent this conventional wisdom. And Job will get into acrimonious debate with them. But even more, we're going to find out that Job is not so guilt-free himself. He has a lot to learn, and so do his friends. This is where the drama and the power of the story lie. The center part evokes a legal setting. One can look at it as sort of like a court drama. There are charges and countercharges, witnesses, a plaintiff and a defendant, a cross-examination that's often sharp, and witnesses who are treated as hostile. Evidence is entered into the proceedings. This motive is found elsewhere in the Old Testament writings. The prophets use it effectively at times, for example, in indicting Israel for its failures and its sinfulness. Job demands justice, and in a way he's putting God on trial. He blames God for his predicament. Job is asking why and who. Why is this happening? And who is to blame? The prologue will set up the story, give some background, and establish the context. We meet Job right away. He is wealthy, very wealthy, and he is very devout. His wealth is found in servants and cattle. This suggests a patriarchal time frame. He's not living in a big city. His wealth is not in gold and silver. He is not in a metropolis, as a businessman might be. It is more rural. He is not near Jerusalem, neither living there nor going there for his worship. Job is living in the time before the kings, so before 1000 BC. Not only is Job pious, but he makes up for its lack in others in his family. Other characters in the story are introduced. We meet the sons of God, and we even meet Satan. So it's written in exilic or post-exilic times. Again, if it is post-exilic, it could be the idea of symbolizing all of Israel, but it seems to be far earlier than that. It's in patriarchal times, like a historical novel might be written today of an earlier time. Now, it's in an area that is surrounded by pagan cultures. And so polytheism, a multiplicity of gods and goddesses, as I've referred to already. And they were thought oftentimes in these pagan cultures as meeting together upon occasion, like a council. But of course, for the Jews, for those of the Old Testament faith, there could be only one God. For us Christians, and in the New Testament and on, also only one God, a trinity of three persons in one God. So for the book of Job, keeping the strict monotheism, this council could be looked at like a meeting of God with his angels. It's not all other gods. Keep that in mind. The writer of the book of Job is borrowing ideas that were common in the culture of his time when he wrote. At this point, the author of the book is not concerned with theological truths or doctrines, but merely using what was common thought in order to set the stage for this coming drama. There is no accepting of many gods and goddesses, nor actually would Satan have a place at the table. The theology comes in the middle section, and again, the popular thought is exposed and critiqued. Other answers are noted. It is quite interesting that Satan has a place. He arrives late, no less. His excuse: he was roaming and patrolling the earth. Very thought-provoking. A chilling thought, if you think about it. The presence of the devil in the world, roaming and patrolling the earth, some translations say. Always on the watch for a chance to do evil. And he can engage in a contest with God. This is just simply a way to set up the whole story. It is not in any way on the part of the author saying that Satan is the equal to God or has a presence before God or anything like that. It's a literary figment, perhaps, or a literary device to get the drama going. A dramatic device, not a theological truth. Not at all. And it's very clear that Satan is not equal to God. He must ask permission to do anything to Job. That's another truth that's being safeguarded. God does not do evil. This is very clear. So the devil must ask permission to hurt Job. And God sets limits to Satan's mischief. While setting the scene, the author preserves some of these theological points. He has to. God is in charge. He does no evil. These truths are safeguarded. The images are just props in the story to get it going, to get it moving. The book of Job deals with questions of free will, the wisdom of God, justice, suffering, and why all of this is. The prologue is establishing the pretext to get it going. So we'll take a look at this. God does not do evil, but evil is in the world. We can do evil to ourselves and to others. God respects free will. We can harm ourselves and others. This is the reality. This is part of what the author is wrestling with. And so Satan asks permission and is granted leave only to attack Job's possessions, not his person. So Job loses his wealth as it was in those days. And he responds with a famous line in chapter 1, verse 21. Naked I came forth from my mother's womb, and naked shall I go back there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That's chapter 1, verse 21. I'm using the New American Bible translation simply because it's the most familiar. It's closest to the lectionary in the Catholic Mass, and very popular as well for private spiritual reading and communal reading as well. So I'm using it simply because it's familiar and it'll be easier to follow along. In chapter 2, Satan comes again and he ups the ante. Again, he arrives late. God himself speaks well of Job, but Satan asks to do more. Now he gets permission to attack Job's body, but he cannot kill him. Clearly, God has set limits, and clearly Job has not brought this upon himself. But Job's wife has her doubts. In all of this, Job keeps his cool. Then Job's 3 friends come to commiserate with him. They don't even recognize Job, so ghastly is his appearance. They are speechless when they behold him. The prologue ends with them utterly overcome for 7 whole days. Then chapter 3 begins the central part of the book. If you're following along in your Bible, I will not quote long sections. You can stop the narrative as it goes on and read at your own pace and then pick it back up. You can pause however you're listening to this. And again, when I quote the scriptures, I'll be using the New American Bible. So it may sound different from a Bible you're using. So I'll give chapter and verse as well so you can keep on your way. Throughout the book, the author will do 2 things. 1, Job will push the boundaries and then back off. We would say he is pushing the envelope in modern terminology. He takes 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And he will do this repeatedly. He's probing. The second thing the author will do is to give us clues, give us hints in Job's questions or clues to the ultimate answer. Keep both of these things in mind as you read through the text and listen to this commentary. 2 things to remember. The author of Job is a great writer. He has Job push forward and then pull back. This gives a drive to the narrative. It moves the thought forward. And also, like a good mystery, the writer will give us clues. Now, even if you're not a fan, you can appreciate the skills of a mystery writer. A good one will leave clues throughout the work. And after you know the resolution, you can go back and read the work again and see where those clues were strategically placed. You can do the same with Job. The author of Job leaves us many clues to the final answer. I will point some of them out as we go along. And with that, then, we're finally ready to start the text itself. The first cycle of speeches. Job starts out things by stating his case. And again, remember, it's important to note that the 3 friends are representing the conventional wisdom of the time, which is found in the wisdom literature, for instance, of the Bible itself, and found also in other cultures as well, in different varying forms. Now, all throughout the book, the 3 friends are going to represent the conventional wisdom. Sometimes they'll do it well, sometimes not so well. We'll see where it leads to as we go along. This is their role, actually, in the discourse, in the debate, to state what is the given, the conventional wisdom. And this is what the author is testing and pushing against, these limits to wisdom. He is debating and questioning the conventional wisdom and its adequacy. Job is an extreme example of pushing the boundaries. This heightens the drama. And so, Job begins. He feels sorry for himself. This takes an entire chapter. The whole 3rd chapter is self-pity. It can seem a bit melodramatic after a while. He curses the day he was born and wants to punish that day itself as if it were possible. And so chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. Verse 3, perish the day on which I was born, the night when they said the child is a boy. Verse 4, may that day be darkness. May God above not care for it. May light not shine upon it. So he asks why he was even born. In his depression, he figures he would be better off dead because he wouldn't have to suffer. One would say Job might be laying it on pretty thick or some other similar cliche, and he keeps this up for the entire 3rd chapter. And some people would sympathize with his position in some of this, both in the ancient world and in modern times as well. Then each friend will take up a position based on the conventional wisdom, but Job will answer this by showing its inadequacy. So the author of Job is really questioning wisdom in this way. This is not to deny this wisdom, but to show that it falls short in some cases. Eliphaz responds in chapter 4, verse 1 to chapter 5, verse 7. He starts out gracefully in verse 2 of chapter 4. If someone attempts a word with you, would you mind? He acknowledges that Job has instructed others, tried to help them in their troubles, but now the roles are reversed. Job shared his faith and piety with others to bolster them in their troubles. Cannot his same faith help him now? The author is giving us a hint here that will be developed later. In verse 3, also too in chapter 4. Look, you have instructed many and made firm their feeble hands. Your words have upheld the stumbler. You have strengthened faltering knees. But now that it comes to you, you are impatient. When it touches you, you are dismayed. And finally in verse 6, is not your piety a source of confidence, and your integrity of life your hope? Then Eliphaz takes issue with Job. In chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, he sums up his position. Reflect now, what innocent person perishes? Where are the upright destroyed? As I see it, those who plow mischief and sow trouble will reap them. So Eliphaz feels that Job's misfortune is his own fault, the result of his own sinfulness. This again is the conventional wisdom. We are the cause of our own troubles. And that's often true, but not always, and not in Job's case, it seems. We'll see this develop more. He stresses through this whole chapter, the author of Job, and remember, it is one of the pagan theories as well, that we cause our own trouble. So Eliphaz speaks of having a deep meditation at night, like a revelation, often spoken of in the Bible as coming in dreams. And he learns from this. In verse 17 of chapter 4, can anyone be more right than God? Can mortals be more blameless than their Maker? Even this early, the author has given us a clue to the final answer. And it comes from the conventional wisdom, so he's not disregarding that altogether. So it would be good to take note of some of this even at this early point. Moving on to chapter 5, Eliphaz counsels Job to ask God's forgiveness. No one else will come to his aid. If he was in Job's place, that's what he would do, according to Eliphaz. God sees and knows all. He thwarts the cunning, but aids the humble. He gives some examples of God's providence. He helps in time of famine. He protects from danger in wars. If God reproves, he also rewards. And so Job should seek his approval and not his reproach. Then you will be happy and secure. At the end of Eliphaz's first speech, he chides Job a little. In chapter 5, verse 27. See, this we have searched out, so it is. This we have heard, and you should know. Again, a subtle hint at what is going to come up from the author. Job responds in chapter 6. He is still pitying himself. His anguish outweighs the sands of the sea. He thinks God has struck him with poisoned arrows in verses 1 to 4 of chapter 6. And he pushes ahead, stating that even if God should crush him, he will at least have the consolation that he, Job, is right. Job even starts a brief challenge to his friend in verse 9. Even that God would decide to crush me, he would put forth his hand and cut me off. Then I should still have consolation and could exult through unremitting pain because I have not transgressed the commands of the Holy One. Chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. And in verse 24 of chapter 6, teach me, and I will be silent. Make me understand how I have erred. And in chapter 6, verse 29, think it over. Let there be no injustice. Think it over. I still am right. He's pushed now. In chapter 7, Job looks at the lot of animals and compares the futility of his own situation to theirs. They have no wisdom as intelligent beings do, but they give birth to their young, and they do our plowing and labor for us, and not much more. Job feels his life is about as much drudgery as theirs, so his self-pitying goes on. He won't complain except that he is so badly off and feels he has a right to make his sufferings known. His days are going like the wind. Job will switch from addressing one or more of his friends to delivering almost a soliloquy to no one in particular, and finally to addressing God. So as you read through this, you can watch. It will shift as it goes along. This is seen in chapter 6 as Job begins addressing his friend. Then he seems to be speaking to none in particular, continuing into chapter 7. But by verse 12 of chapter 7, Job is now addressing God. This is a device of the author used in these central chapters, chapters 5 through 31. Beginning with chapter 7, verse 12, Job complains to God that he is teasing him, treating him unfairly. And it's not only Job. Job thinks God does this to many people. Job seems to be thinking the same as those non-biblical cultures mentioned earlier, who thought that God really doesn't care or is teasing, or further, some of them thought the gods were just cruel. Job asks a series of questions in verses 17 through 21 of chapter 7. Even if he did wrong, the punishment seems more than the sin. Here is an example of the forward and back movement in the author's treatment. Job is sinless is a bold step forward. Job has done nothing wrong, so he does not deserve what he has received. Yet, no one is sinless, and so he retreats a little bit. He admits to sin, but then forges ahead again and asks, well then, why hasn't he been forgiven yet? Why is he still punished? He did nothing wrong to deserve all that has happened to him. And he asks why God hasn't forgiven him, whatever his fault might be. In chapter 8, Bildad now speaks. He continues the argument of Eliphaz. He takes issue with Job's answer to Eliphaz and repeats the argument that Job must have sinned. Bildad puts forth the conventional wisdom as well. Job must have done something to deserve all this. If indeed Job is innocent, then God surely would have heard his plea. Bildad speaks this wisdom by reminding Job that experience can be a great teacher. In chapter 8, verses 8 through 10, inquire of the former generations, pay attention to the experience of their ancestors. As we are but of yesterday and have no knowledge, because our days on earth are but a shadow, will they not teach you and tell you and utter their words of understanding? He uses examples from nature. Again, the creation theology perspective that I mentioned earlier. You will not find much of, if any, of the salvation history theology perspective in the book of Job. It's almost all creation theology. And Bildad thinks that whatever is happening now, God will eventually intervene and set things right for Job, in verses 20 and 21. Job responds in chapter 9, verse 2. I know well that it is so, but how can anyone be in the right before God? Verse 3. Should one wish to contend with him, he could not answer him once in 1,000 times. In verse 4 of chapter 9. God is wise in heart and mighty in strength. Who has withstood him and remained whole? Again, the examples come from creation theology. God can move mountains. He can shake the earth. He commands the sun and the stars. And Job gives many similar examples. And remember also in chapter 9, verse 17, because we will see it exactly again later. With a storm, he might overwhelm me and multiply my wounds for nothing. We'll see something similar to that, almost identical, later on. Job will look for a response, even demand one, yet be amazed when he in fact receives it. Then in verses 22 and 23, Job presents the idea of the non-biblical cultures noted earlier who thought God was capricious, or that he was indifferent, or even toyed with us. Chapter 9, verses 22 and 23. It is all one. Therefore I say, both the innocent and the wicked he destroys. When the scourge slays suddenly, he scoffs at the despair of the innocent. Some translations put that he does not find it unseemly when people suffer. Here in the New American, the most recent, he scoffs at the despair of the innocent. Job opines that God punishes both the good and the bad, and God even laughs at the despair of the innocent. This is seen in other cultures, and so Job is offering the idea, following them, that God is capricious. One irks a god or a goddess and must find out who it was that they hurt or insulted, and then placate that deity. One goes to a priest or other advisor to find out whom he must appease. Sometimes he will invoke another friendly god or goddess to help him to mollify the irate one. Israel, of course, could never do this with its strict monotheism, but the thought was prevalent in other cultures, so the author brings it up as a possible answer, but rejects it. It is a way of answering the solutions put forth by others. Israel rejects them out of hand. When we look at suffering, the scourge of our day, whatever it is, the same philosophical questions are pondered. How can this happen? The author of Job presumes a god or gods. Atheism is not considered. Today, one might reject the notion of God and consider all things random, or might think God indifferent or capricious if indeed he even exists. In some ways, some think like those of the ancients. Job takes the idea of God as fickle or acting on whim to its logical conclusion. A clue is found in chapter 9. You can't argue with God. Job states that no one can fight God, yet he won't listen to his own words. Job is trying to contend with God. This is his hubris, his downfall through pride. This is going beyond man's boundaries. Job tells why it is futile to go against God, but then he backs up and pushes forward, backs up, by stating no one can be justified before God, but he doesn't heed his own words. In chapter 9, verse 29, if no rhyme or reason to justice, then what's the difference? In chapter 10, verse 3, Job asks of God if he, God, likes oppressing people. Verse 3, is it a pleasure for you to oppress, to spurn the work of your hands, and shine on the plan of the wicked? Job intimates that God would be spiting his own creation if he treated it in such a cavalier way. Why bother to create man only to hurt him? He asks God to leave him alone and give him a little peace and quiet before he dies. Now, Zophar speaks, starting in chapter 11. Again, the conventional wisdom. He shows a little more animosity towards Job. The drama is growing. In chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. Should not many words be answered? Or must the garrulous man necessarily be right? Shall your babblings keep others silent? And shall you deride and no one give rebuke? His position, as with the others, is that Job must have sinned. He just doesn't know in what it was. He offers the idea that if Job knew his sins, he wouldn't be so obstinate. So Zophar will tell Job to admit his wrongdoing. Then all will be well. Zophar uses creation theology as well and gives a clue, too. Verse 7, chapter 11, verse 7. Can you find out the depths of God, or find out the perfection of the Almighty? And in chapter 11, verses 13 to 15, if you set your heart aright and stretch out your hands toward him, if iniquity is in your hand, remove it, and do not let injustice dwell in your tent. Surely, then you may lift up your face in innocence, you may stand firm and unafraid. All the friends are of one mind. Job must have sinned to deserve all that has happened. But Job is right at this point, at least. He is innocent. And the conventional wisdom has no answer for this. In chapter 12, Job responds to all three friends. In the style of the best defense is a good offense, he lashes out at all three friends. In chapter 12, verse 2, he has a sarcastic reply. No doubt with you, the people with wisdom shall die. And he claims they are making sport of him rather than commiserating with him. Verse 4 seems to be quoting the jeers of Job's other neighbors. I have become the sport of my neighbors. The one whom God answers when he calls upon him, the just, the perfect man, is a laughing stock. But then he backs up, and he admits God is all-powerful. Even beasts of the field know that much. God controls all creation, everything in it, and all events as well. Job even gives examples, again, from creation theology. God can reverse the situation of anyone. Kings can end up slaves. The wise, counselors, priests can be sent away. In chapter 13, Job claims to know just as much about wisdom as his friends. As he gave that sarcastic jab at them that wisdom was going to die with them, but he says, no, they are trying to speak for God, but they're doing a poor job of it. He pushes forward by thinking he can hold his own in front of God. Chapter 13, verse 3. But I would speak with the Almighty. I wish to reason with God. And in verse 18, I have prepared my case. I know that I am right. A definite legal courtroom motif. This courtroom setting, Job feels, has not done him justice, so I'll take him to court. We would say today, I know my rights. Job wants to sue God, of all people. Take him to court. But then Job steps back. He wants God to promise not to hurt him or terrorize him. And then he pushes again. says either he, Job, or God can go first in verse 22. And Job doesn't wait for an answer. He goes first. In this chapter, in verse 23, he challenges God to tell him his sins. Then he backs up and uses examples from nature. He acknowledges that no one can be found without sin. God sees and knows everything. It's an interesting comparison that he uses. He cites a tree. You can cut it down, and a sprig can grow, and it can begin again. But when a person dies, he won't come back to life, at least not on earth. It's over. The author is not concerned about any afterlife or any existence after death, and certainly not ready for a discussion of resurrection. The concern is only about this life on earth and its misery. He contains it to those parameters. The afterlife is not considered. He's not denying it. It's just not a part of the discussion at this point. And the answer is not to just simply wait for a better life in heaven. The second cycle of speeches begins with chapter 15. Eliphaz begins it again, and his tone is sarcastic. He is upset with Job and his reasoning. He takes Job to task for challenging God. Job is offending piety and lessening devotion by his stance. His own mouth condemns him. In verses 7 and 8, we have a clue. Do you know the counsels of God? Verse 7, were you the first to be born? Were you brought forth before the hills? Do you listen in on God's counsel and restrict wisdom to yourself? Does Job know more than anybody else? Another clue in verse 14. How can any mortal be blameless? Anyone born of woman be righteous? Eliphaz says Job is only foolishly hurting himself. In chapter 16, Job replies to Eliphaz, Job can be just as sarcastic. I have heard this sort of thing many times. Troublesome comforters, all of you. In verse 3, is there no end to windy words? What sickness makes you rattle on? No real answer is given here. He's just fed up with what his friends are saying. They are kicking him while he's down. They're not helping. He's looking for sympathy instead. And God has let this happen too. In verse 10, chapter 16, verses 10 and 11. They gape at me with their mouths. They strike me on the cheek with insults. They are all enlisted against me. God has given me over to the impious. Into the hands of the wicked he has cast me. Job wants a shoulder to cry on, and he's not getting it. But God is letting others insult and humiliate him instead. So as you read this chapter, note where Job is speaking to his friends and where he seems to be addressing God. In verses 20 and 21, he says it is his friends who have let him down, and God sees this. Chapter 17, Job feels everyone is mocking him for his troubles. No one takes up his cause. He feels a lot of self-pity. Chapter 17, verse 1. My spirit is broken, my days finished, my burial at hand. Surely mockers surround me. At their provocation, my eyes grow dim. And in verse 6, I am made a byword of the people. I am one at whom people spit. Job imagines things to be worse than they are. Bildad speaks for the second time in chapter 18. He adds nothing new to the argument. He keeps to the conventional wisdom, simply states that usually it is the wicked who suffer, and keeps that thought throughout the whole chapter. Bildad will then give examples of one rushing headlong into a net, or a noose hidden in the ground that trips one up, one who loses all in a fire, like a plant that dries up to the roots. Job replies in chapter 19 that he feels that they have been unfair to him. In verse 2, how long will you afflict my spirit, grind me down with words? Even if he is at fault, they have taken advantage of him. Even more, God has been unfair as well. in verses 5 through 7. If truly you exalt yourselves at my expense and use my name as an argument against me, know then that it is God who has dealt unfairly with me and compassed me round with his net. If I cry out violence, I am not answered. I shout for help, but there is no justice. God has even caused his friends to turn on him, and also his servants, other acquaintances, even the kids in the neighborhood, in verses 9 through 19. In verse 21, Job asks for pity because of what he sees as God's doing against him. Pity me, you my friends, for the hand of God has struck me. Job pushes the boundaries. God does not do evil, yet Job seems to think he does it for no apparent reason at all, if not purposely. In chapter 20, we have Zophar's second speech. He tells Job he should know that the prosperity of the wicked is short. Verse 4, do you not know this? From of old, since human beings were placed upon the earth, the triumph of the wicked is short, and the joy of the impious but for a moment. The wicked will disappear quickly. In verses 6 and 7, though his pride mounts up to the heavens, and his head reach to the clouds, yet he perishes forever, like the dung he uses for fuel, and onlookers say, where is he? But he's still looking for the faults of Job. He tells Job that he should have known that God would get him sooner or later. God always punishes the evil person, and it's usually sooner than later. He bolsters this with many examples. He sees God as sending these calamities. This is all the way people saw God acting. It can be disconcerting to us, especially when seeing God does no evil, as noted earlier. But it reflects their thinking and the stage of their development at the time. There was a closer connection between cause and effect. They saw God having a more active role in the suffering of mankind. We hold that God does not actively hurt people, but we live in an imperfect world. This is part of what the author is trying to deal with. We will see how the author works this out at the climax of the book. Now we see only hints and clues. In fact, we may wonder if there is even any answer possible. Through Job, the author is probing, offering possible hypotheses, rejecting others, especially those of other cultures. He may reject the solutions offered by other cultures, yet still he has to address them, as they were prevalent to varying degrees. We can take some time for reflection along our way through this. Certainly the questions have been raised throughout the long history of mankind, and these viewpoints perdure to today. Not a few people will see God punishing those they consider wicked by visiting calamities, natural disasters, or whatever upon them. To their way of thinking, these wicked people get what they deserve. God will get you for that. Rather, we should look to God to help us bear our misfortunes and for consolation. Otherwise, wouldn't it seem futile to pray to God in times of trouble if he indeed was the agent of that trouble? It would appear illogical. And we'll stop this first episode and resume our debate and our discussion in the next time.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.